All right, let's dive right in today. We're talking about giftedness and, that drive for perfection. Do they really go hand in hand?
Yeah. It's interesting because so many of those guides out there, like the ones for parents and teachers, they really point to perfectionism as like this key thing to look out for in gifted students.
Right, like it's almost presented as part of the deal.
Almost like it comes with the territory.
But is that really the case? I mean, what does the research actually say?
Well, it's actually pretty complex. Some research does suggest that there's a connection there, but other studies, they haven't found like super strong evidence to back it up.
It's almost like common sense, though, right? You think of the gifted kid, and you kind of picture someone who's, I don't know, super focused and just wants to get every little thing exactly right.
Right, like that classic image of the overachiever who's maybe a little bit stressed out about every detail. But the question is that just a stereotype?
And that's kind of where it gets really important because if we just automatically assume that giftedness equals, being this anxious perfectionist, I mean, that can have a real impact.
Yeah, it can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Imagine constantly hearing, oh, you're gifted, so you must be a perfectionist. That can really affect how a student sees themselves.
Absolutely. And it might even lead to them not actually reaching their full potential.
Hmm.
So to really support gifted students, we need to figure out what this connection, if it exists, really looks like.
That's where this meta-analysis that we're going to unpack today comes in.
Okay.
It's called Intellectual Giftedness and Multidimensional Perfectionism, a meta-analytic review. Stricker and his colleagues published this one in 2020.
Okay, so we're talking about meta-analysis. That means essentially they're looking at a whole bunch of other studies, right?
Yeah. So they didn't go out and do their own study with students. Instead, they gathered data from 10 different studies.
Oh, wow.
And all of those studies had compared perfectionism levels in groups of gifted students versus non-gifted students. So in total, they looked at data from over 4,300 students.
That's a pretty good sample size to work with. So when we're talking about perfectionism, though, what are we actually looking at? How are we measuring that?
That's where that multidimensional part of the title comes in. The researchers focused on two main aspects of perfectionism. These are pretty widely used in the field: perfectionistic concerns and perfectionistic strivings.
Concerns and strivings. Okay.
Okay, it's kind of like two sides of the same coin. Perfectionistic concerns are more on that worry and anxiety side,
Okay.
and perfectionistic strivings are more about high standards and the drive to achieve.
Got it. So concerns kind of sounds like the negative side of things, and striving sounds a little more positive.
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
Hmm.
Perfectionistic concerns, those are the things that can really cause problems. This includes constantly worrying about making mistakes, doubting your own abilities, feeling like everyone expects you to be perfect, and that feeling of just never being good enough no matter how hard you try.
That's definitely the kind of perfectionism that you can see leading to a lot of stress and actually holding people back.
Yep, exactly. And there's research linking these concerns to things like higher levels of neuroticism,
Okay.
problems with things like procrastination, especially when it comes to academic tasks, and even, unfortunately, signs of psychological distress like burnout and even thoughts of suicide.
So this is some serious stuff.
It is. And when you look specifically at gifted students, these concerns have been linked to lower confidence in their academic abilities, lower grades, which is interesting, less satisfaction with life overall, and just a general lack of intrinsic motivation.
Which is a big one because that's what really drives people to learn and explore and really reach their potential.
Exactly. So understanding and being able to address this type of perfectionism is really important, and especially in a group like gifted students who might already be facing these unique pressures.
Okay, so that's concerns the more worrisome side. Now, what about perfectionistic strivings? What does that involve?
Okay, so strivings, these are more about setting those really high personal standards and then having this genuine belief in the importance of meeting those standards. And this side of perfectionism is actually often linked to more positive things,
Oh, interesting.
like being more conscientious,
Okay,
less likely to procrastinate, higher achievement, especially in academics,
makes sense.
and even positive emotions and greater life satisfaction. And in gifted students, these strivings have also been linked to things like better academic confidence, higher grades, and you guessed it, more life satisfaction.
So aiming high, but without all that anxiety and self-doubt that can really weigh you down.
Yeah, exactly. Striving without the constant fear of failure. And most researchers tend to agree that these concerns are really the more problematic side, compared to the striving aspect.
Right, so understanding those two different dimensions, that's key here to get the full picture.
Right. It's not just perfectionism as this one big thing. It's more nuanced. And that's important when we're looking at the relationship with giftedness. So the big question is, what did Stricker and his team find?
Yeah, what's the headline? I mean, is perfectionism truly a core part of being gifted?
Well, the results of the meta-analysis are pretty interesting and I think pretty significant. So when they looked at perfectionistic concerns, those worries and anxieties, they didn't find any significant difference between the gifted students and their non-gifted peers.
Interesting. So it's not like gifted kids are inherently more worried about being perfect.
Not according to this analysis, the numbers just didn't show a strong enough pattern to suggest that.
Okay.
They use this measure called G, and basically the smaller the G, the more similar the two groups are.
Okay, got it.
And for perfectionistic concerns, that G was really small, so small that it wasn't statistically significant, meaning giftedness as a trait didn't seem to be fundamentally linked to those negative, anxious forms of perfectionism.
That's a pretty big finding, right? It kind of
Yeah.
challenges that common belief that giftedness equals all that stress and anxiety about being perfect.
Exactly. Now, when it came to the other side, the striving, they did find a statistically significant difference, but the effect size was small to medium.
Okay, so explain that to me. What does that tell us?
Well, it means that as a group, gifted students did show slightly higher levels of perfectionistic strivings compared to those non-gifted students.
So they're more likely to set those really high standards for themselves, and that belief that it's really important to reach them.
Yeah, that's the general trend the data points to. But here's the key part. That effect size, even though it's statistically significant, it still indicates a lot of overlap between the groups. Almost like 80% overlap.
So it's not like a black and white thing.
No, not at all. It's definitely more of a tendency.
Okay.
And it's really important to remember, just because a gifted student might set high standards, that doesn't automatically mean that they're going to be super worried about failing to meet them.
So you can be driven without being, burdened by all that worry.
Exactly. The two dimensions, concerns and strivings, they seem to operate somewhat independently, at least in this context.
That makes sense. Now, earlier you mentioned that the researchers found substantial heterogeneity in the original studies that were part of this analysis. Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that actually tell us about the consistency of these findings?
Yeah, so heterogeneity basically means that the results across those different studies, they varied quite a bit.
Okay.
And this is true for both the concerns and the strivings. They use this statistic called I squared, and for both of these aspects of perfectionism, that I squared was really high.
Okay.
And what that tells us is that there's probably other stuff going on, beyond just giftedness itself that is influencing those results. It suggests that maybe there are other factors at play that weren't really looked at in detail in this meta-analysis.
So things like age, gender, where the students are from, the kind of gifted program they're in, that kind of thing.
Exactly. All of those things could potentially play a role. It's a reminder that studying human behavior, it's never simple.
Never simple.
There's always more layers to peel back. So even with all this data, it's clear that we need more research to really understand the nuances.
Okay, so what are some of the big questions that still need to be explored?
Well, for starters, we need more studies that look at these relationships across different age groups, genders, cultures, different countries. The studies in this analysis, they were mostly from the USA and Europe.
So we need a broader perspective.
Exactly. And another big limitation is that all of these studies relied on self-report.
Meaning the students themselves were filling out these questionnaires about their perfectionism.
Right, and that brings in this possibility of what we call social desirability bias, which means that people, they tend to answer questions in a way that they think makes them look good.
Yeah, it's hard to be totally honest about your flaws sometimes.
Especially for gifted students, right, who might feel like they have to present this image of being super competent and driven.
Right, they might not want to admit to any anxieties or doubts, even if they feel them.
Exactly. So future research could benefit from using multiple methods, not just self-report, maybe observations from teachers or parents
Okay.
to get a more balanced perspective. The researchers also pointed out this really interesting question that hasn't been fully investigated, and that is, do gifted and non-gifted students even interpret those perfectionism scales in the same way? It's like we have to make sure that we're all speaking the same language when we're measuring these things.
Right, like our tools need to be calibrated correctly.
Exactly. And finally, this meta-analysis didn't really dig into these different clusters of perfectionism that we sometimes see, like healthy perfectionism versus dysfunctional perfectionism.
Right, so there's all these different ways that perfectionism can show up.
Right, and some studies have tried to categorize students that way, but the methods are different. The number of categories varies, so it's really hard to compare those findings directly. But this is a really interesting area for future research.
Okay, so even though this meta-analysis gave us some pretty clear answers to those initial questions, it also opened up like a whole new set of questions to explore.
Yeah, and that's how science works, right? One study leads to more questions and more research, and that's how we get closer to a deeper understanding.
Okay, so let's talk about those practical takeaways.
Hmm.
How should this research change how we think about and approach gifted education?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that it really challenges that stereotype of gifted individuals being inherently, burdened by this maladaptive perfectionism.
Right, it's not a given.
And that's crucial for teachers, counselors, parents, everyone who works with gifted students. We have
Yeah.
to be careful not to create those self-fulfilling prophecies.
Right, you don't want to constantly tell a student, oh, you must be so stressed out all the time.
Exactly. It can really affect how they see themselves and how they approach challenges. Secondly, this research suggests that we shouldn't be using perfectionism as a way to identify giftedness.
That makes sense. It's not a core characteristic.
Right, and using it as an indicator could lead to misidentifying students or even overlooking some gifted kids who don't fit that mold.
Okay.
And finally, while this meta-analysis helps us understand that strong link, that automatic link between giftedness and those maladaptive forms of perfectionism, well, the research doesn't support that. It's really important to remember that perfectionism, especially those concerns, the worries, they can still be an issue for gifted students.
So it's not like we're saying perfectionism doesn't matter.
No, not at all.
It's more that we need to approach it individually.
Exactly. We need to move away from those generalizations and really understand each student as a unique individual, because that's what they are, whether they're gifted or not. They have their own needs, their own struggles, their own strengths.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. It's amazing how something that seems so simple, like, oh, gifted kids are perfectionists, when you dig into the research, it's just way more nuanced than that.
It really highlights the importance of looking at the evidence and not just relying on assumptions or stereotypes.
Okay, so as we wrap up our deep dive into giftedness and perfectionism, here's something for everyone listening to think about. We've seen that gifted students do have a bit of a stronger tendency to set those high standards for themselves, but it's not necessarily accompanied by that worry and anxiety about failure. So how do we best nurture that drive for excellence? How do we create environments, whether it's in schools or in homes, where that curiosity and that desire to learn can really flourish in a healthy way?
Right. How do we encourage those strivings without fueling those negative concerns?
Exactly. Because we all want to see these students thrive, not just achieve.
Right. We want them to be happy and well-rounded individuals who can reach their full potential in a way that's sustainable.
Okay, so that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning.
See you next time.